How's everybody going today? Welcome back to the channel, Armor Studio NYC. Today we're going to be doing our second video on the Dragon Type 97. Today we're just going to be pretty much painting the model, and this is very exciting for me because this is going to be my first time doing a camo scheme aside from the winter camo that you saw on the Stug 3. That's tri-camo, and it's also freehand. I had kind of practiced this technique a little bit before the channel, and I'm going to be very happy to explain how I do it to you guys today. So as always, we start off with our black primer. We prime all of our parts, and these are going to be the colors that we use. We're going to use some dark green, dark yellow, natal brown mixed with black, because the natal brown is a little light for this. So we're going to be using our really nice detail brush, our Infinity CR Plus, and we're just going to pretty much outline or section off some parts of the model that we would want to make interesting with the tri-camo. So it's kind of important to have an idea in your mind of how you want the camo to go. Also, you need to make sure that the camo scheme makes sense. It's not overboard with one color and underwhelming with another, and you also want to make sure that you cover up all of the black primer as well, unless of course the model tank does have some black in it, but then you will need to further post shade or pre-shade that. So we jumped a little bit and we started with the dark yellow, and now we're going with the dark green. I was having a few airbrush problems during the filming of this, and I'm not really sure why, but I deep cleaned the airbrush, and after a while I was able to get a nice consistent flow. Also, it's going to jump to brown being completed because brown was a little difficult to film. It wasn't really coming out the way I wanted to, but this is pretty much the final product here. We made sure not to overspray the tarps, just that way it makes it a little bit easier for us to weather, but this is pretty much a decent example of how you'd want a camo to look. Each color is represented in a way that kind of makes sense, and you would also want to continue that camo scheme onto the road wheels, which we have done here with our three colors. Now comes a part that really adds a lot of depth to the model, and that's going to be pin washing all of these bolts. So this Dragon kit does have a lot of detail and a lot of surface detail, and we wouldn't want to really lose that with our paint. As you can tell, the bolts are fairly visible in some parts, but we really want to make them stand out. So we're just going to grab our Tamiya mixture of black and brown, and we're just going to pretty much outline every single bolt that you could possibly outline, just to make it look like the bolts have some type of shadow and contrast to them. So as you can tell here, the bolts are visible, but they do blend, I feel like, too much with the model, and they kind of make it look like they're just colored circles according to the paint scheme that they're in. So we really want to differentiate those bolts and give the viewer something different and interesting to look at. So just go around the entire tank. It does take a little bit of a time to complete this step, but it is worth it in the end. And if you thin your paints right and you're using a very, very solid airbrush, then this step becomes very easy and not as tedious either. So it's very, very important. The air pressure for this was turned down to about 20 psi, but one thing that's really cool about this Harder and Steenbeck is that it's a dual action airbrush, so you are able to control how much paint comes out. If you can tell, I'm really not pulling back that far. I just want the paint in a nice controlled manner, and I want it to lay down exactly where I want it. And we're just going to continue here. It is important, even though on the darker color like green, it's maybe a little bit harder to see, but it is important to keep everything nice and uniform, simply because it does matter. You know, it's very vibrant in those dark yellow areas. It's fairly good in the brown areas. On the green areas, it's a little bit harder to see, but it would look really weird if you had some bolts outlined and some not outlined. So this is what it looks like after every single bolt was painstakingly pin washed. Needless to say, my hand was definitely cramping after this, as it took me about 30 to 45 minutes with the airbrush. Also, just a reminder that when you do paint a tank camo, if you want to make your life easier, you can kind of do that clouding technique that I've showed you in other videos, just so that way you don't have to go and post or pre-shade. Here we're just taking our Tamiya dark gray and we're going to just color in all of these exposed metal parts or parts that we would want to rust later, because dark gray is a very nice foundation for rust tones, so you don't really have to worry about, you know, changing the rust tones that much due to the fact that they're covered in another color and them looking very odd. So for instance, you're going to see later we do it to the exhaust shrouds as well, and rust wash on a yellow paint looks much different than a rust wash on a dark gray or exposed metal. So we are just going to go ahead, and we do typically hand brush this because the parts that we like to rust typically run a little small, and unless you're a guru at masking or you're a guru at, you know, very, very precise painting, getting a piece like this in gray without having some overspray and covering up some of the beautiful work that we had just done prior would be a little difficult. So this step I do like to hand paint. Also, hand painting I feel like does give it a little bit more texture than airbrushing, which adds to that rusty not only feel but the texture. So for the exhaust shrouds, I kind of decided to keep certain colors where they were in terms of the camo scheme, because I wanted to make it look like the paint chipped because of heat, but there was still some camo there. So we just used our sponge method to chip it, and we're going to rust that later on. Here we are just painting the tracks. This is a mixture of black and brown as well as Hull red from Mr. Hobby Colors. So yeah guys, this is pretty much what we have. We also hand painted the tarps in correct colors. The tarps were painted in Tamiya buff, and the camo netting was painted in the same dark green that we did on the actual tank. So yeah, I'm fairly happy with how this came out. I think the pin wash does look really, really great. Of course, continuing the camo pattern into the lower hull area is important for when we weather it in the next step. However, we're not done. We still have to add a few decals, which I will show you guys at the end of the video. But until then, thank you guys for tuning in. Sorry it's a little bit of a short video, but there's really not much to cover with painting, especially when you have a handy tool like an airbrush. So thank you guys for tuning in. Join us next week for when we weather this tank, and let me tell you, I think it's probably one of my better works that I've had in the history of my modeling experience. Anyway guys, I'll catch you next week. Thanks for tuning in.